A single mother asked, "Could you spare the leftovers?" But what the millionaire did next, no one. It was just another cold night. One of those when the wind seems to whisper loneliness in your ear. In a quiet corner of an upscale cafe, a man pushed his plate away, not for lack of appetite, but for lack of meaning. Caio Nobre, a familiar name, a millionaire businessman, owner of Nobre Construction. But in that moment, he was just a solitary man, enveloped in silence. Since the accident, everything had lost its taste, literally. His wife and daughter, the only two who ever made him laugh, had been taken without warning, and with them went his will to live. While the world outside kept running, his life had come to a standstill. That's when she appeared, a young woman in simple clothes, her hair thrown up carelessly, a baby cradled in her arms. Without preamble, her voice trembling, she asked, "Could I have the leftovers?" They were for her son. The words hit him like a punch. The cafe seemed to freeze. People around pretended not to have heard, but Caio heard. And more than that, he felt. The baby began to cry, softly. A cry he recognized. It was the same sound that haunted his dreams when he thought of his daughter. He slid his plate across the table. The woman nodded her thanks. She didn't eat. She sat on the floor, pulled a plastic spoon from her pocket, and began feeding her child, slowly, carefully, as though every spoonful was an act of love. Caio couldn't look away. It was simple, but intense, as real as the emptiness inside him. When she left, he stood up and followed. Curiosity drew him forward. But it was more than that. It was as if a forgotten part of himself was being called back to life. He rounded the corner and saw a sight he would never forget. She was climbing into an old car, the baby still in her arms. That was her home. He didn't know her name. He knew nothing about her, but he knew he couldn't ignore her. Hours later, he returned and knocked on the window. She said the baby had a fever. She thought it would pass, but it didn't. The crying grew louder, the desperation more visible. He didn't hesitate. He took them both to the hospital. At reception, paperwork, waiting, neglect, until Caio, used to having his needs met, put the weight of his name on the line. The baby was seen. It was serious, a dangerous infection. It nearly turned fatal. Caio waited in the hallway, sitting on the cold floor. He stared at his hands and thought, how did a plate of food bring me here? For the first time in a long time, he felt something real. It wasn't pity. It wasn't charity. It was connection. The reception clock read almost midnight. The hospital, modern and brightly lit, seemed more concerned with aesthetics than with urgency. Caio strode in, holding Livia in one arm and the feverish baby clutched to her chest. He asked for help. The receptionist barely looked up from her computer. "I need the file. ID of the guardian. Insurance info." Livia tried to explain she had none of that. Caio cut in, clearly impatient. He told her who he was. The name still opened doors. But here, they hesitated. "That's not how it works, sir." And Nico, the baby, was getting worse, red, limp, eyes half closed. That's when Caio snapped, not in anger, but in desperation. "If this child dies in here from negligence, you'll see my face splashed across every headline tomorrow, not as a client, but as the one suing." 2 minutes later, Nico was seen. The doctor confirmed it. An advanced infection. If they'd waited a few more hours, it might have been too late. Livia sat in silence in the hallway chair, hands covering her face, utterly soundless. She didn't sob or make a scene, but there was the quietest scream of a mother at her limit. Caio watched her. He didn't know what to say. He was used to fixing everything with orders, contracts, and money, but this hurt. Hours later, with Nico stabilized, he offered her a hotel room. Livia refused. We'll be fine. We'll manage. But the story didn't end there. Someone at the hospital had taken a photo. Kayo next to a woman holding a baby. Caption ready, "The tycoon and the homeless mother." By morning it was on every website. Theories, judgments, insults. Scam. Gold digger. Another one trying to cash in. Kayo wanted to sue, to take down the stories, but Livia, she just wanted to disappear. "I can't stand being looked at like this," she said, tears brimming. "I just wanted to save my son." He said nothing. But in that moment he knew, if he didn't do something, she'd vanish from his life forever. And this time, he wasn't going to let that happen. The whole country seemed to have an opinion on them. Gossip sites, TV shows, social media, everyone judging a story they didn't really know. Livia became the target. They said she was taking advantage of a vulnerable man, that the baby probably wasn't even hers, that it was all a setup. Meanwhile, she hid in the simple room Kayo had arranged. She didn't want to go out, didn't want to eat. She only watched her son, now sleeping more soundly, unaware of the storm raging outside. Kayo tried to protect her, but for the first time he realized money wasn't enough. She needed to be heard. And it was he who suggested it, an interview to tell her story, for real. Livia resisted, fear, shame, trauma, but after days of silence and online humiliation, she agreed. The interview aired on a primetime talk show. The set was simple, but the emotion raw. Livia didn't read from notes. She spoke as though opening a wound one last time, hoping it would finally heal. She told how she was kicked out at 18, how the baby's father vanished when he learned she was pregnant, how she went hungry, slept in shelters, was rejected by her family, and how that night she only asked for food because her son's cry was too weak. She knew he was getting worse. Kayo sat beside her, silent. The camera caught his teary eyes. The audience, once cruel, fell silent. The internet turned inside out. Thousands of comments. "Sorry, Livia. You're an amazing mother. Thank you for not giving up." The next morning, her phone buzzed non-stop. Messages of support, interview requests, offers of help. But nothing mattered more than one line Kayo said that night as the interview ended. "You taught me how to feel again." Her room, and there, with no cameras and no witnesses, she smiled for the first time in a long time. Not because she'd won, but because, for the first time, she was seen for who she really was. A few days after the interview, their routine was starting to change. Livia was calmer, Nico healthy, and Kayo different, less tense, less distant. It was as if the chaos had made room for something new, peace. But then the letter arrived, a plain, yellowed envelope addressed to the boarding house where she was staying. No clear sender, just a name. Uncle Roberto. She read it slowly, wary. Inside was a request. "I'm very ill. Before I go, I need to tell you the truth. Please come." Livia didn't want to go. That name brought only pain. It was at Uncle Roberto's that at 18 she'd been told she was no longer welcome, that having a baby was a disgrace. But Kayo encouraged her. Sometimes what feels like the end is really the start of something bigger. And she went. Their reunion was cold. The old house smelled of regret and guilt. In the bedroom, Roberto lay pale and thin, eyes sunken, but lucid. "You have every right to hate me," he said. "But I couldn't leave without telling you the truth." What came next, she never could have imagined. Roberto wasn't her uncle. He was her grandfather, and Aunt Nilda was her grandmother. Livia had been raised as their niece to hide the teen pregnancy of their real daughter, Livia's mother. Her mother, still a teenager, had been kicked out when she got pregnant. She'd struggled, died young, never knowing her parents wanted to forgive her, and Livia grew up living a lie. The most shocking part, There was an inheritance from Livia's real parents, a small property sold years ago. The money existed, but Roberto and Nilda kept it, locked away, forgotten, just like her. "That was cowardly," he said, eyes glistening, "but I want to make it right. If you can forgive me." Livia didn't answer right away. She stepped out of the room, breathed deeply, cried. Not from anger, from relief, because deep down, she'd always believed she was unworthy. Now she understood the abandonment wasn't her fault. It never was. She returned, took his hand and said, "I forgive you, not for you, but for my son. I don't want this cycle to continue." With the inheritance returned and the truth finally out, Livia could start over, and that's exactly what she did. Caio offered comfort, support, even a house, but she declined. She wanted to rent her own place, open a small business, rebuild with her own hands. "You don't need to prove anything to me," he said. She replied firmly, "It's not for you, it's for me." Using her inheritance, she opened a little bakery in a modest neighborhood. She'd learned to make sweets during her pregnancy as a way to pass the time and ease her anxiety. Now that craft sustained her days, batter, filling and affection. Caio visited often, bringing flowers, helping with Nico, checking in on her progress. But something had changed. Livia was no longer the woman he'd met in that cafe. Now she smiled with conviction, made decisions, found her voice. And that captivated him more than anything. But deep down, he feared losing her. He was scared she'd go on without him, that he wouldn't be needed anymore. And she, for her part, feared relying too much. She knew she loved him, but she also knew she was only whole now. She didn't want to become invisible again in a life that wasn't hers. Then they argued for the first time. Small things, but weighted with unspoken fears. He wanted to protect her. She wanted space. Hours later, Caio returned and said just one sentence. "I don't want to save you. I want to walk beside you." She cried, for the first time, not from pain, but from being seen. That night, they dined in silence. Nico slept in Caio's arms, and she watched them with one simple thought. Maybe this new beginning isn't just hers, it's theirs. It was Sunday, mild sun, dewy grass, and the gentle sound of children running through the park. Caio arranged everything without saying much. He only asked Livia to meet him there with Nico to spend some time together. She found the gesture odd. Caio wasn't exactly the romantic type, but she went. She found a blanket spread under a tree, 2 simple lunchboxes, and a new toy beside Nico. The boy laughed as if nothing in the world could ever hurt him. Livia sat down. They laughed. They ate. They played. But there was something different about that day, a sweet silence, like knowing you're about to live something unforgettable. After their snack, Caio picked up Nico, stood, and walked toward Livia, with tears in his eyes. Not kneeling, no ring. He simply said, "You showed up at the worst moment of my life, and you brought back the only thing I thought I'd lost forever. Purpose. I want us to build this new life, together. Will you marry me?" Livia didn't answer right away. She looked at Nico, who, even without understanding everything, reached his arms up between them as if he knew. And then came her answer, not in words, but in a hug. Nico, hugging them both, blurted out a simple line that exploded in their hearts. "Now we're a real family." Tears fell, not because of the gesture, but because of the journey. Because only they knew how hard it had been to get there. Months later, they were married. A small ceremony, no frills. Guests seated on plastic chairs, a simple cake and flowers picked from a friend's backyard. But no wedding in the world was more genuine than this one. There, among shy smiles and silent promises, they said yes. Yes to a fresh start. Yes to healing. Yes to the one thing money can't buy, real love. Time passed. Not long, but enough to transform a man once marked by loss into someone completely different. Kaio, once the austere face of real estate, was now seen in a new light. Lighter, more present. The once minimalist, cold office now bore colorful drawings on its walls, a little clay giraffe on his desk, and framed photos of genuine smiles. But it was on an ordinary afternoon, during an important meeting, that the most unforgettable moment happened. Nico, now 5 years old, burst into the room holding a crumpled sheet of paper. "Dad, can I read my essay?" The executives laughed awkwardly, but Kaio nodded. Nico climbed onto a chair, cleared his throat like a grown-up, and read, "My family began with a plate of food. My dad gave the food, my mom gave the love, and I gave the miracle." Complete silence. Kaio couldn't hold back the tears. Not because of the words themselves, but because of what they meant. That boy was the miracle, not just for having survived, but for having saved him. Kaio. Saved from an empty life, a colorless routine, a purposeless future. After the meeting, Kaio brought the paper home and framed it. He hung it on the living room wall, right above their wedding photo. Later, he sat on the couch beside Livia. They watched the children playing, Nico and their newborn daughter. She whispered, "Do you think all of this really started with that plate of food?" Kaio smiled. "I think it started when I chose not to look away." If this story moved you, leave and tell me, what's the simplest gesture that's ever changed your day? Give it a like, subscribe, and help this message reach those who need to remember that love still begins in the little things.